Who do you fear the most when installing ICT cabling? If you're like me, it's probably the electrical inspector. And that's because they're enforcing the National Electrical Code book. And let's be honest, that book is hard to understand. So today I have a special guest and he's going to help us shed some light on codes. Welcome to the show where we tackle the tough questions submitted to us by installers, estimators, project managers, customers, IT people. We are connecting at the human level so that we can connect the world. If you're watching this show on YouTube, would you mind hitting the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified when new content comes out? If you're listening to this on a podcast, would you mind leaving us a 5-star rating? And if it's not a 5-star rating, shoot me an email. Tell me what I can do to make it a 5-star rating. Those two little tips helps us to help beat that nasty algorithm so that we can get this information out to more people and educate more people. And that's what it's all about. While this platform is free, if you do like to support it, you can go to Patreon or go to our support page on letstalkcabling.com and find methods to help support it. But this content is free and will always remain free. So let's get on with the show.
Don't hang up that phone. We've found what you're looking for. Welcome to the Let's Talk Cabling podcast with Chuck Bowser, RCDD. Well, seeing how we're pulling Category 6A, the most powerful twisted pair in the world, you got to ask yourself this one question. Did I pull 295 or 300 feet? Well, do you feel lucky? Do you, punk? In this podcast, you'll learn the differences between a 66 and 110 punch tool, the proper way to install a support cable, along with testing and certifying the cable. What exactly does RCDD stand for? Registered Communications Distribution Designer. Just the expert you need to ensure your cable plant performs exactly as designed. The elite professional, knowledgeable, and experienced in leading-edge ICT design principles. So join us as we talk about the ever-changing world of telecommunications. From ISP to OSP, from copper to fiber, design to installation. Now, send the new guy to the truck for a bucket of dial tone and the cable stretchers, while you listen to an informative program on telecommunications.
I consider myself fluent in all things code related, but there are times when I get confused by the code book. So I reached out to someone who's probably forgot more about the code book than I can actually remember. Now, this person, I came across him about 2 years ago when I came across one of his articles. And I was like, I need to get to know this guy better. Now, before we dive deep in anything code or code book related, it's got to be stated yet once again, the authority having jurisdiction has the final say or interpretation of the code book. Not what I say, not what my guest says. Today's guest is Tim Kuhlman. And like I said, I became aware of him years ago reading some of his articles. He's got like 9 articles, and I just read one of them today. Tim Kuhlman is an RCDD and a professional engineer, and he has over 31 years of experience in construction and design of structured cabling for communication systems. Tim is a principal with technical engineering firm called TCOM and has been an active member of the telecommunications industry and a BICSI member since 1998, a little bit longer than me. For 10 years, he has presented at BICSI and has published several articles in Consulting Specifying Engineering magazine on interpreting the National Electrical Code book. That's why I consider Tim a friend and, more importantly, an expert. Welcome to the show, Tim. How you doing?
Doing good. Good to be here, Chuck.
It's a pleasure to have you. How's the weather over there on the West Coast?
Well, it's a little rainy today. We've had a dry spring so far, but we see some weather moving in. So, when it's raining and it's dreary, well, that's when we're the happiest.
Yep. Send some of that rain our way. Central Florida, we need some rain. My 18 garden beds need water. They need a lot of water. So let's get on with this. The first one I want to cover is, why is there so much confusion over the code book in the low voltage industry? What's your opinion on that?
Well, it just like you stated in the introduction, it is not an easy document to read. I mean, keep in mind, the code was originated from lawyers underwriters that got tired of paying out claims because buildings were catching on fire in the textile industry, years and years and years and years ago. And so, and the reason why was because there wasn't a common electrical code on how things were going to be installed. So, you do have an industry that grew out of lawyers that like to work, talk in legalese, and it just grew from that. Now, you also look at the organization of it, how the document is put together, and that's not easy to follow. You need to understand the structure. Just because you can do an index search, or nowadays you can do a PDF, in a PDF you can do a word search, you got to look at context, because context is huge in the electrical code. If you were to look up low voltage, because I know you mentioned low voltage already, guess what? You probably would not find the word low voltage in any of the sections that we typically apply in telecom. So right there, that term right there causes confusion because, well, one, how do you define low voltage? It all depends on what section of the code you're looking in. And our stuff, it may fall under the large umbrella of low voltage. From the electrical code standpoint, it may not. From a licensing standpoint, it may. I years and years ago, I had a limited low voltage contractor's license when I was in Wyoming. And so I know that from a trade standpoint, that term is used for low voltage for fire alarm and telecommunications and that type of wiring, but we don't necessarily see it in the code itself. So some of it, I think, is our terminology.
I say that all the time because we qualify ourselves as low voltage, but you exactly. I love Control F. For those who don't know, that's the keystroke function to find a word in a PDF file. Control F, type it in, and it'll pull up all the occurrences of that word. But then it's up to you to read the paragraph that surrounds it to see if that actually applies to you. I've generally been told that the term low voltage, when it really, for us, it really means less than 600 volts. Anything over 600 volts is generally considered high voltage. Is that a true statement?
Actually, medium voltage. So 600 and above is medium voltage, and there, which is clearly defined. It says medium voltage, 600 volts and greater, but it really doesn't have a firm definition in one spot for low voltage. So there you might find low voltage under RVs. You might find it in a couple other different locations, but you just don't find it in our section. Unfortunately, that's the way they wrote it.
It's kind of funny you mentioned RVs. A couple of years back, my wife and I were looking at buying an RV, and once we started looking at pricing Class A's and realized they started 70,000 and go up to like 2 million, right? So we came up with the harebrained idea, well, we'll just buy an old school bus and we'll strip it out and we'll build it out. And so I joined the forum, and everybody in the forum says, oh, the code book doesn't apply to RVs.
Surprise.
Exactly. So a little bit ago, you mentioned about how the initial code book was actually created by lawyers and underwriters. Yeah. I got to wonder what makes them think they're qualified to talk about anything electrical, but that's neither here nor there. So in today's environment, how is that? So we're in the 2020, right?
Yeah.
So the 2023 is being currently worked on. How is it edited or created or updated? What's that process?
Well, I think even then, back when the code was originally written, it may not have been written by lawyers, but it was motivated by underwriters, insurance companies to have a standard. And so they did what a lot of industries do. They bring back together a panel of experts that represent the industry, that have put on the manufacturing process of components, on the installation process, on the inspections, engineers that design buildings. These are the organizations that actually come together and make the code panels. So when it comes to the electrical code, for example, the 2021 code, which is the one that came out last year and is just now being adopted in some states, not all states adopt it at the same time. If you were to look, you'd see at the very beginning of it, the different code panels that own different articles within the code. And so, for example, Code Panel 3, it covers Article 300, where we see a lot of the execution of work, how to deal with installation of wires, plenum spaces, all that is under Article 300. And you see Article 725, which is signaling cable and data cabling and such. those, we have a Bixie representative, for example, that sits on that, and that represents our trade organization for ICT from a Bixie standpoint. That's Richard Anderson that sat on the panel for that version of the code. When you look at other sections that we're strongly involved with, which is 770 for fiber optics and 800 for communications, Bixie is being represented by Robert Jensen. And they might represent Bixie. They have their own companies or they work for their own companies, but they sit in that position where they're representing Bixie's interests. You also have folks that are representing NECA and NEMA and IBEW and other companies or other trade organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, really it's meant to have a level playing field. I mean, we saw, I want to say several years, but I know I'm dating myself. Probably maybe 20 years ago, we saw where one company wanted to enforce or have that all plenum cable had to have a certain type of, meet a certain type of testing or material specification. And what the code panel found out was only one company really had the recipe for making that type of a plenum cable. And so as an industry, they said, well, this might be good, but it would give one company an unfair advantage. And so
was something like that, would they handle that like in a permissive statement then?
You know, I don't know. There's if you go to the nfp.org, you can see a lot of what goes on. Just create an account and log in, and you can see a lot of dialogue that goes back and forth when it comes to official filings, and you can read through all of that on how the code panel votes and the issues that are brought up. And by the way, anybody who wants to see the copy of the electrical code, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy it. All the codes are free to view by anybody by just going to NFPA's website, nfpa.org.
Oh, wow.
And you log in and you can see the current code, and sometimes you can even see past codes. And you can see all the codes, you know, like NFPA 1, which is fire code, NFPA 75, which deals with information technology rooms, which are, you know, computer rooms. You can see all those. They're free. It's a viewer, so it's not as necessarily as easy to work with, maybe as having your own PDF or a hard copy, but it's accessible by anybody.
Right. Does it cost to get into that?
No.
Nice.
Just sign up.
For those who don't know, when you buy, I got a copy of the code book behind me. I think I paid $75 for it, $95 for it, something like that, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And as the code book changes every three years, well, it doesn't change. They add to it and delete stuff out of it.
Right.
So, and like you mentioned earlier, some states adopt faster than others. That's actually one of my questions. Because if you actually look at if you go to the Google machine and type in NEC adoption map, you'll find the map of all the states in the continental United States, at least. And it tells you what version of the code book they're in. And it's a patchwork of, you know, this one's into 2017 and this one doesn't even have a statewide adopted code book and stuff. Why does it take states so long why can't they just, as soon as it's published, say, okay, we're good?
Welcome to the Republic. It's for the same reason. Every state has its own licensure for contractors and their own licensure for driving and their own licensure for PEs. Every state has that authority to regulate and adopt the codes for their state. And so, for example, California, they have the California Building Code and the California Electrical Code. And typically they're on a 3-year cycle that is just 3 years removed from what the current National Electrical Code is. That's just the way the state has made their decision for adopting codes. So they're looking at regulations, they're looking at a ripple effect, they're looking at, do they need to be more stringent than what, say, the National Electrical Code is? I mean, there's nothing like a big fire in your city, like right. Chicago, San Francisco, to require additional level of safety and concern in either because of their environment or their past history. And so what you will see, like with the California Electrical Code, they have taken some things and they've augmented it where they may not allow for maybe certain, like PVC in certain instances where the electrical code was. And then you go one step further where the city of San Francisco also had a problem with fires and earthquakes. where they might even go even a further step, and they might have even a more stringent code than the California building code. So in any time we do an interpretation, you always have to look at what is the current code that's going to be applied to your project, or that is being enforced by the authority having jurisdiction.
Right.
Because those are the rules that you have to apply. Just because it came out, something new and fancy came out in 2021, doesn't mean that you can automatically use it. You might be able to use that for an argument for an alternate means and methods, but you may not be able to use that immediately with the AHJ if they haven't adopted that code.
And that's one of the reasons why I don't dread code questions, because it keeps me in the code book. But it's such a it's a sand pit of potential gotchas, right? I mean, it's like you said, the local authority having jurisdiction can increase the code for the area. Chicago's, the city of Chicago for many years made you put 4-pair cabling in conduit. There's nothing in the NEC code book that requires that. That's just what the HJ local said that they got to do. I tell you, another place where it comes a lot of confusion is when you talk about the 3 exceptions for lightning protection. Because there are some jurisdictions out there, they'll say we don't allow those 3 exceptions. You always have to put in lightning protection in our area, which is why I always tell students, make sure that you call the authority having jurisdiction first. Don't go on what Chuck says, because it's such a pitfall. It really is.
And really, when you're talking about liability, what's the cost of lightning protection for say a Cat 5e or Cat 6 circuit for a wireless access point or a camera on the outside of a building? You compare the cost of that compared to the liability that you install something and it brought energy into the building that wasn't supposed to, and it hurt somebody or caught the building on fire. So, and you look at from that specific issue, you look at the map when it comes to lightning strikes. And it's really only an area in the Pacific Northwest that has fewer than 5 lightning strikes a year. That
I got a map for you. I got a map for you that shows the 5 or fewer thunderstorm days a year across the United States, and another map from the REA that shows the ground resistance. Because remember, it's both of those, right? It's the 5 or fewer thunderstorm days a year, and an earth sensitivity less than 100 ohms per meter. And there's only just a few, 4 or 5 things in Southern California that have both of those.
Yep.
Yeah, and I do that in every class too.
We design a lot of industrial facilities, large data centers, where there's a lot of voltage around. And even there, if we, say we're taking data for power monitoring out to the generators alongside the data center, that data is being buried parallel with the high voltage, or the voltage coming out of the generators. And so from a prudence standpoint, if there was a ground fault, even though you're not exposed to maybe a lightning strike because of the close proximity of the buildings, we would still put lightning protection just from a ground fault standpoint. In that case, we wouldn't call it lightning protection, we just call it a protection circuit. Right. And then maybe even have to add secondary protection, because the equipment that we're connecting to is very sensitive. So now you have protection, primary protection, and you have secondary protection.
So you mentioned the word liability several times. And I know that I've said this in many, many classes, and I don't know, maybe you can confirm or correct me, but I tell students all the time that if they do work that doesn't meet the code book and somebody gets injured or somebody dies because they didn't do it per the code book, I've always told them they could end up being responsible for that. Is that a true statement?
Yes, it is true. I mean, if you're working as a engineering firm, or you're working as we're either licensed as an engineering firm to provide services in a state, or a contractor is licensed by the state. That licensure says that you're obligated to follow for design or installation to the codes. That's how you got your license. And then if you're representing an owner, or even the owner is responsible for meeting the requirements of the code. As a homeowner, you own your house. If you do something that has anything to do with your house, that could be the electrical wiring, telephone wiring. It could be if you have a ham radio antenna and you bring that cabling in, that's Article 8, was it 820 or something like this? Mm-hmm. If you bring that cabling in and you do it wrong, or say you don't put protection on it, then the underwriter, the insurer, can come back and says, the reason that this building burnt down or wasn't protected is because you didn't follow the code, and therefore they're not going to pay. Someone's going to pay for it. And so whether it's the installer who didn't install right and the owner is then going to go seek damages against the owner,
Right.
or it's the owner itself is going to have to pull out of their own pocket. That's where liability comes in, is did I design something, or did somebody construct something that didn't meet the minimum code requirements, and therefore there's a responsibility if an accident happens that the proper amount of safety and protection wasn't in place. So yes.
I heard a story a long time ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago, back when fire stopping was really getting kicked off, and we were really starting to pay attention to it in the low voltage industry. And again, as an instructor told me, and I never researched it, so I don't know if it's true or not. Maybe you can shed some light on this as well. But they said that an inspector got put in jail because they inspected a project, signed off on it, and they found out that the inspector never left their car. They just kind of, and then of course the building caught on fire and people were injured. But they said that inspector got put in jail. So are inspectors held to the same standard?
I don't know if they're held to the same standard, but if I signed something on the bottom line that I've taken ownership, or I've taken a step of inspection or review, and I didn't actually do the work, it's called fraud, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so yeah, that would be against the rules or against the law to commit fraud, to say that you did something when you didn't. So, and by the way, Chuck, we can have a whole nother half-hour discussion just on fire stopping.
Oh yes, my favorite subject. Matter of fact, I'm creating a 2-hour course on fire stopping that I'm going to be putting out to everybody for CECs, and I'm not going to charge anything because I think it's that important. Just you sign up for it, you watch the class. There'll be a little question thing at the end just to make sure that you did watch it. Again, I want to be upfront and honest with everybody, and then they'll get a certificate that they can submit to Bixie for CECs, and I'm not charging for that course. So I'm still working on. I got some of the fire stop manufacturers to send me some products to put in the video and stuff. So I'm hoping to get that out there soon. But so let me ask you a question. So low voltage industry, right? What sections of the code book should the RCDD or the installer really focus on?
Well, I would say there's the top 3, but number 1, before you focus on any section, find a way to get some training. Go to sign up for a class, sign up for something that's reputable, go to Bixie, get some actual training, because just knowing the main articles isn't enough. You need to understand the structure, right? So let me just say, for example, if you're in ICT, the top three that you focus on is Articles 725, 770, and 800. So number 1, understand what type of circuit you're installing. So if you're installing a data circuit, PoE, signaling circuit, customer-owned voice circuit, whether it's analog or voice, you're going to be working out of Article 725 because it deals with remote signaling and power-limited circuits. If you're dealing with fiber optics, it doesn't matter if it's a fiber optic cable being brought into a building by a service provider or it's a customer-owned fiber optics. All fiber optics is in Article 770. And if you're dealing with a communication circuit, and now that is going to be a very specific term within the electrical code, not the general term. If you're dealing with a communication circuit, that circuit that's extending a service from a service provider or carrier, then you're talking about Article 800, or I should say in the 2021 code, they divided 800 into 800 and 805.
Right. So
I'm just going to say 800, but in 2021, it's really it's both of those, 800 and 805.
Gotcha. Because, I've sat in a lot of classes and, I've talked about this before on different calls. I've been in a lot of classes where I've had, let's just say, older instructors.
Yeah.
They would say, well, the only thing that's governed by us is Article 800, right? So now you're listing out 725 and 770. I understand the 770 because that's the fiber optic stuff. Can you be a little more specific on why would 725 apply and not 800? And are they aren't they reasonably the same?
Well, they're similar. So the good news is if you spent your entire life working in Article 800 and installing for Article 800, you've been probably okay because the requirements are very similar. There's only some subtle differences between the two. And, we can go into that in more detail later, but for the most part, they're identical. As I said, the issue with Article 800 is that it's only extending a service from the carrier.
Right.
Once that circuit stops at a router, a modem, some type of interface, then any circuits past that is not Article 800, it's 725. And so it used to be they had this really long definition of what a communication circuit was. We've had that for the longest time. It was very confusing. In Article 2017, you really had to break it down in its bullet points to understand what it says. But in 2021, they actually consolidated the definition. It's very similar to the definition I summarized in my seminars. It says now a communication circuit, the circuit that extends service from the communications utility or service provider up to and including the customer's communications equipment. Stops at the equipment.
Right.
Once that circuit stops at equipment, it now becomes 725.
Right.
So I think that's part of the confusion in our industry is that we grew out of the telephone industry.
Right.
BIC engineers, right? You used to have to hire a BIC engineer to design the telephone system inside a building because before the breakup of Ma Bell, which is 1984 and before, the entire telephone system was typically owned and operated by the local telephone exchange. After the breakup, a lot of turmoil in our industry, those BIC engineers were no longer designing infrastructure inside buildings. Now it's all privatized, right? So that's where we see BICSI come together as Building Industry Consultant Service International to organize this group. And so even then, what were we installing in 1984? Telephone.
Right.
There was data back then, but it was
proprietary. It was only cat. Yeah, exactly. Type 1, Type 3, Type 9, RG59, Twin X.
A little bit of coax and RG56 for some token ring.
It was all proprietary cabling.
It was a VT100 terminals coming off of a mainframe. We didn't have Ethernet yet. That was going to come.
We're showing our age.
I know. But you asked for history lessons of why we got to where we are.
Right.
So naturally, when we started looking at some of the early Ethernet networks, or even before that, LatticeNet and such, we were using telephone products. We were using punch down products, telephone products. Well, where do you put all this stuff? You put it in the telecom room because why? You can use the same blocks, you can use the same racks. In some cases, we can even use the same cabling.
Right.
So a lot of us, we just grew out of that, and it was the same technology. So you're still using BIC engineers. It's just that those same BIC engineers also brought along what they knew about the code, which was they always worked out of Article 800. If you look at the structure of the code, really it's chapters 1 through 4 are the general requirements.
Mm-hmm.
You have the specialties, which are 5, 6, and 7. And all of those work together. 5, 6, and 7 might take exceptions to what's in 1, 2, 3, and 4, but they all work together. When you look at the organization of the code, and it literally says it in the front, chapter 8 basically stands alone.
Yep.
It's exclusive, where all the other sections are inclusive. I wasn't there then. I wasn't on a code panel back in the day when that was all developed, but I believe it was done that way because if you look at all the chapter 8 sections, it's really about utilities bringing services into a building. You got your cable TV, you got your telephone, you got your broadband. All those are in your chapter 8. Utilities needed some section of the code that they had to follow, and they broke it out as being exclusive. So really anything in chapter 8 that you read, chapters 1 through 7 do not apply unless they're specifically referenced.
Right.
Whereas if you were to read something in chapter 7, say the fiber optics section, everything in chapters 1 through 4 apply unless it says it's excluded.
Right.
Just the opposite. So I think that's where we got to where we are is it's just the way we grew out of the telephone industry, and some of those folks just haven't let it go yet, or they haven't adopted it. But when you look at, for example, POE, I think POE helped clear up a lot of things for folks, because where is POE? It's in Article 725.
Right.
You don't see really any reference to power over Ethernet or power in Chapter 8, except for when you get, I think it was in Article 640. Well, in 840, 160 for powering circuits, you see that it talks about a 60-watt limit. But once again, I've heard many folks talk about, well, we don't have to worry about that if it's less than 60 watts. Well, let's take it in context. We're talking about premise powering of communications equipment and communications cable.
Right.
We just understood what a communication circuit was. It comes from a utility, right? So you're talking about the premise powering of utility equipment and utility cables are coming from the utility. So how much of a sector of that is of our business it is? Well, it's not the cabling that goes inside a typical office building, right? We're talking about something more like fiber to the home.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting power and fiber to the home, and now you're extending that circuit now further into the home. Okay, there's that 60 watt, but that 60 watt does not apply to a wireless access point that we're putting in an office.
Right.
Buildings. No, all that POE is strictly in Article 725.
So since you brought up POE,
yeah,
let me ask your opinion. And here's my concern is, at some point, the electricians are going to say, wait a minute, you're doing how much energy across the 4-pair cable? That's our work, not your work. And I see a fight coming on between licensed electricians and low voltage. What's your opinion?
Well, ring the bell, because it's only round 12. It's an existing fight that's gone on ever since conduit was being installed for telephone cabling back in the day. Was it going to be IBEW or the Communication Workers of America installing that? The same, probably 10 years ago, it was the argument when it came to, say, lighting circuits being done over Ethernet.
Like LED lighting and stuff?
LED lighting over Class 2 and Class 3 circuits, because you see Article 725 is all about Class 2 and Class 3, but you have other articles that are very clearly about lighting. And when the technology came out, they don't necessarily go look at the code boundaries. That's where these code panels and other trade industries have to get the code up to speed. And so that's why we started seeing, I think it was in, 2017 code, we started seeing POE requirements. That's the code catching up to technology and saying, okay, we're seeing power, and power does have an effect. But when you look at Class 2 and Class 3 circuits, there's still power limits. And everything we've seen so far in the way of the POE power levels, they've all stayed within the parameters and limitations of a Class 2 or Class 3 circuit, which, let me just cut right to the end, that's what our data circuits are.
Right.
We install a data circuits is considered a Class 2 or a Class 3 circuit.
Yeah, you and I had a conversation previously, a couple of weeks back, about cable bundling and power over Ethernet. Remember that conversation? I reached out to you because I told you I'm pretty good with the code book, and I looked at that table. I could not figure out that table. And so pretty much, if I remember our conversation correctly, you said, hey, if you use LP cabling, limited power cabling, you don't have to worry about that chart.
Right, and that's another thing of why, they say the code's not written for the casual user and it's not written as a training device. You literally have to look at the paragraphs, look at the structure of the paragraphs. And when you start looking at, I think it's 725, 144.
Yes, you got a good memory.
Well, I look at this book a lot. You'll see that there is one article, or should say one paragraph, that just talks about CL2 and CL3 cables, right? Class 2 and Class 3. The paragraph below it talks about CL2-LP and CL3-LP. So the article that deals with the LP, you'll notice that there is not a reference to the table and bundle size, and therefore the table doesn't apply. Now, in the 2021 code, they did add a reference to the table, but really it has more to do with if you exceed the value of the LP rating on the cable, say you go from a 0.7 and you really want to put a full amp per pair on that cable, well, then you go back to the table and use it as a reference. But as long as you stay within the limits of what the cable is marked, there is not a bundle restriction. If you looked at the other paragraph above it that didn't have the dash LP next to the cable designators, and you read that, you will see that you have to reference that bundle size in that table, and therefore that's what you apply. We've taken the approach at our company of telling our clients, just go with a dash LP cable, because then you don't have to hire an engineer, a licensed engineer like myself, to do a bunch of calculations when you decide that you want to migrate your say wireless access points or cameras to a higher power level. Just look at the rating that's on your cable and don't exceed it.
For the same reason why, if you don't know what kind of ceiling it is and you don't want to go seek out a building engineer or somebody, just use plenum cable.
Yes.
You know it's going to be good there.
Yes.
It may cost you more, but it's going to be good there. Okay, one last question, and this one wasn't in the thing. So I do a Thursday night after hours live stream, and was it last week's or the week before? Can't remember. Somebody asked me. I got 2 RCDD salary questions. Right, I'm not asking you to tell me your salary. One of the questions was, how much if a person has a PE and an RCDD, who's going to make more money? And I noticed that you got both. You probably have more experience. I only have an RCDD. So I went to Indeed.com and looked up salary ranges. And to me, it looked like a PE made more money than an RCDD.
Well, you need more of an education to have a PE. And I tell you what, the last thing I want to do is pit PEs against RCDDs, because you know what? Just because you have an RCDD doesn't mean that you can design a telecom system. It just means that you met the minimum threshold to pass a certain number of tests, and you got a piece of paper at the end. And you know what? The same thing is true from a PE standpoint. It's only good as the person that holds it. But to get a PE, you do have to go through a minimum requirements of so many years of school of education from an accredited school. Then you have to have at least 4 years of experience before you take a test. And so, and that's not necessarily the requirements for the RCDD. And so who makes more? Well, chances are maybe from a PE standpoint, you will make more just because of the years of investment of education and problem solving. It absolutely does not mean that a PE is going to be better designing a system than an RCDD will. I frankly think we need both. I think this is a huge thing in our industry, Chuck. I think we need both. I think, with an RCDD tells me that somebody has met the minimum specialized training to get that certification. Just because you're a PE, you know what? PEs, when we go to school to get an engineering degree, they don't teach us anything about the electrical code. It was probably mentioned in one section in one class briefly, but there's absolutely no training in the electrical code. That's the real world. The real world is, and that's why you have to have 4 years of experience in the real world before you can even apply for a license. It's that apprenticeship period. But I think you need to have both. I think we need to have PEs with RCDDs. I think, the two needs to work together. How about this? I think Bixie needs to go out and embrace and work with the National Society of Professional Engineers, and you work together.
Yep. I agree 100%. And the guy that sent me the question, I don't think he was trying to compare a PE to an RCDD. I think he was trying to, I'm saying it could have been a she, I don't know, because it was in an email. I think they were just trying to decide which career path to go. And that's what I told him. I told him, I said, honestly, I would pursue the PE. Once you get that, then get your RCDD.
In my case, I wound up, after I got out of school, I actually did telecom construction while I was in school at the University of Wyoming. And then I did construction down in Los Angeles for 4 years while I was doing, after I got out of school. I actually got my RCDD the year before I got my PE license.
Nice.
And because I with a PE, you have to work under, depending on the state, up to 5 different PEs have to endorse that you're actually ready to sit and take the test.
Gotcha.
They're both valuable. I have found in the industries that we focus on, data centers, manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing, large campuses, our clients are asking for PEs to be responsible, or the jurisdiction requires those
Right.
PEs to be responsible. And they do have a legal and ethical requirements they have to follow as part of their licensure. Do you need that for smaller structures? It all depends on the rules in your state. Oregon, for example, is one of those states that require a PE for energized work, but not for telecom or communications or data work.
Huh.
And so if I was competing with another company and they're just doing consulting and they're just doing design for, say, data and communications, they don't need to have a PE license. And that's fine. And I think the state of California is also similar. However, if you're an engineering firm or you're an engineer, you're obligated to stamp and sign as a PE everything that you do, even if the state doesn't require it, because you're required to stamp everything that you do as a PE.
Gotcha.
That's the state's requirement. So I have to stamp the stuff anyways in Oregon. So some have to, some others don't have to. I worked with, talked to the state of Texas and Nebraska, and I think North Carolina, and asked them about their rules. I says, we're designing this building. This is the requirements of this building. So many square footage. This is the type of design we're doing for cable tray and fiber optics and data cabling. And they said, yes, it has to be done under the supervision of a licensed engineer. So it's going to vary per jurisdiction.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate your time, Tim, and I'm definitely gonna have you back on because I'm gonna pick your brain. I'm telling you, because it's funny because I teach every class that I teach, and I teach about 75 a year for my day job. And when we get to the code section, I always go through 90.1, both paragraph A and paragraph B, and it says in there, this is for safety. This is not for the untrained. That's why when you said that word, I keyed in on it. It's not for the untrained person, and it's critical. And there's, we're talking not performance here. We're talking life safety.
That's what it is. It's all about life safety. There are things that the code will allow you to do, such as, put in the same cable jacket, a telephone and data circuit in the same Cat 5e jacket. But we would never do from a performance standpoint. But the code allows it because the two circuits are compatible from a safety standpoint. Right.
So, stapling cable. The code book allows it. Staple a category 6A cable and see how well that works for you. All right, Tim, I appreciate having you on, and we'll have you on a future show.
It was fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor.
That's it for this episode of today's podcast. We hope you were able to learn something. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. Also, leave a rating so we can help even more people learn about telecommunications. Until next time, be safe.